Kerrie Droban, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I kind of feel we have talked previously, full transparency for on another podcast that I co-host. But before that, by happenstance, I was going into my bedroom and my wife was already in bed and she's watching TV and I think it was the ID channel and there you were. And I'm like, no way. That's Kerrie Droban. And my wife is looking at me, is like, you know her? And I'm like, I'm about to. I hope so.
I
So
get that a lot. It's so funny. I have people texting me all the time. I just saw you on TV. And I'm like, yeah, they replay a lot of those shows. So I never know when they're going to be on, but it is kind of funny.
you, has that like changed you at all, do you think? I mean, like any type of relationships or anything? I guess you could say you're a celebrity that way.
It's so funny. I always joke around. I'm like one of those almost famous people, where it doesn't, it really doesn't affect me at all. I mean, I do that. I love doing the shows. I have a lot of fun working with different producers on whatever the investigative show is. Sometimes it's on my book. Sometimes it's on a different case where I go in as the narrator or the journalist, and I am just, it's in my wheelhouse. I'm fascinated by criminal pathology and I'm fascinated by true crime cases. And so I think that, whenever I get an opportunity to work on a project like that with a producer, I really find it compelling and interesting. And so I'm sort of divorced from the idea that this is television and I'm talking to,
Mm.
a camera, and it's a really weird experience to be on television because you don't ever see the producer. You get sort of this, it's sort of like the voice of Big Brother talking to you, asking you questions. You're in a room by yourself. It's very unglamorous, and so that's the funny part. Is like if you really break that part down, there's nothing glamorous about it, but you're getting, the opportunity to talk about a really interesting case. And then, of course, when you see it all pulled together, that's where it becomes really interesting. So it's the magic of television.
Yes, yes, it is. Have you ever, like, you're out grocery shopping or out doing whatever? Has anybody ever says, I know you, but or hey, you're Kerrie Droban.
It does happen pretty often, and I've had some funny experiences, mostly in restaurants, where I'll walk in and suddenly, there's a long line of people waiting for a table, and suddenly I'll be given a table. And I never really quite put it together until halfway through the meal, that this is like they must think that I'm someone. And so, but it's kind of comical to me. Like it.
Well, if it's working for you, more power to you. That's awesome. that's great. So, where did this fascination with true crime and killers begin? Can you put your finger on it, do you think?
You know, um, Honestly, where it really began for me was when I switched from being so I went to law school after I was a poet for a number of years, and literally a starving poet.
Yeah, not a lot of money in poetry usually. Yes.
No money in poetry, but I absolutely fell in love with the craft of writing and the craft of writing poetry specifically. I'd always written poetry, written plays, and I was very, just really interested in just honing that craft. And so I spent a number of years doing that, and then I moved into fiction writing. And I'd had some success with fiction writing and published a couple of novels, but it wasn't really until I went to law school, and law school was the way that I was going to support my writing career. I mean, it's not the other way around.
Okay.
People have always joked with me, like, couldn't you have found something a little bit easier, like less, taxing on your brain to
Right.
fund a writing career? But for me, the two really sort of blended together. I mean, I went to law school with that in mind. I was going to go and be able to support myself and have a really compelling, interesting career. But really, my goal was to be a writer. And so that was how I was going to live. I didn't want to starve anymore. So when I went to law school, I naturally went into prosecution because I loved the idea of telling a story, right? And so when you're a litigator, prosecution, you get to do a lot of trials and you get to talk to a jury. And what I found limiting about being a prosecutor was that I had a set of facts that I really couldn't deviate from. So I was constructing a case and telling the jury, these are the facts, nothing but the facts.
Sure.
So for me, just from a creative standpoint, I really wanted to go into defense work. because that's where I had the opportunity to really weave a story. So it wasn't just, telling the story from the raw facts. I was now deconstructing a case and being able to take the same set of facts and develop a different theory and a different narrative. And so for me, it was like writing a different point of view. And so, and plus I got to really work with defendants and really understand, or try to understand, who are these people? Why do they do what they do? What compels them? What drives them? So that was sort of the framework of it. But as far as getting into true crime writing, I didn't even know there was such a thing when I first started. That's how crazy this was. I mean, I thought that was reserved for journalists. And but I happened to be fortunate enough to have operatives who were ATF agents who were infiltrating the first ever, government infiltration of outlaw biker gangs, Hells Angels, here in Arizona. And I just happened to be fortunate enough for them to have approached me while they were still undercover, asking me to write their story. And so, at the time that this happened, it was stunningly just crazy to me.
So
and I thought,
were these ATF agents, or what Fed branch?
they were ATF agents,
Okay.
the case agent and the main operative in the case. And then there were undercover police officers as well. But the main operative is the one who approached me. And I should say the PS to that is, at the time, I was married to a police officer. He was an undercover agent with the so they knew each other.
Oh,
but
okay.
so it's a weird sort of undercut, like working behind the scenes, undercover in an undercover investigation. So
Okay.
that really sort of launched my career, and that book became Running with the Devil. And so that was, I learned a ton about undercover investigations and, outlaw motorcycle gangs. And I became a quasi biker expert, which was just insane. Actually, the whole idea of it is insane, but that's really where it started.
Do you ride motorcycles?
I did, but no, not anymore.
Okay. Do you prefer riding, or do you prefer to be the passenger?
I actually prefer not to be on a motorcycle at all.
Okay.
Honest, but at the time, I consider myself in some respects sort of like a method writer. You've heard that as method actor,
Yeah.
where you really get absorbed into the role so that you can get into the heads of the different people that you're writing about. So for me, I felt if I'm going to write about an outlaw motorcycle, club and a book about bikers, then I wanted to experience what it was like to actually ride a motorcycle. I mean, some of the operatives that I wrote about had never ridden a motorcycle either. So I wanted to feel,
Wow.
that's the extraordinary part of it. But so I wanted to feel that, and I wanted to know that, because I didn't feel like I could write about motorcycles and about the high that people get from riding motorcycles without being on a motorcycle. So that's what led into my foray to learn how to ride, but it did not stick with me.
Okay. Now, did these ATF agents, police officers, did any of them become fully patched members of the Hells Angels?
So they came, so that's an interesting story. So Running with the Devil is sort of a story within a story. And it's a really famous case. People have probably heard about it. In fact, the main operative, Jay Dobbins, wrote his own book about it. So he's been all over the country and probably different parts of the world talking about his experience with it. But it was an 18-month undercover investigation, the first ever infiltration of the Hells Angels by a government agency. Right. They didn't have a rule book. They didn't know what they were doing. A lot of it was improvisation. And their goal was to become fully patched. But, a lot of things went wrong in that case. And so, in fact, it's sort of taught as like what not to do or what went wrong. And a lot of clients actually read it as like what not to do. And so it became a really interesting odyssey. So did they become full patched? Yes and no. And I'll let the readers read the book to find out exactly what happened with all of that.
yeah, if you don't know biker culture, these outlaw motorcycle clubs or gangs, whatever you want to call them, there's a hierarchy, and there's hangarounds, there's prospects, there's then fully patched members, and they all have their own roles. And until you're a fully patched member, you're not like privy to a lot of stuff, the illegal stuff, at least, that's going on. So that's very interesting to me, because we had the Outlaws in Milwaukee. They're a worldwide organization, and their clubhouse was 2 blocks away from the district that I worked at, and it was just like on TV. It was a compound. I mean, it was on a dead end street. It was a brick, just like bunker, and there's no way you're getting in there, and there's cameras everywhere. They have their own attorney on retainer that's there within minutes. If something is happening there, they just call their attorney right away. And it's a very interesting lifestyle. And and for anyone who might be considering it, they're very, very bad people. You see like glamorous aspects of it, and the biker lifestyle. And I've been riding bikes since I was 16. I love motorcycles, but the raping, the killing, the hate, they're just they're not good people. Gun running, drugs, prostitution, white slavery, you name it, their paws are in it.
Yeah. Well, and that's the interesting thing. I mean, they are a criminal fraternity, if you will. I mean,
Right.
that's their description is. I mean, it's organized crime, and I've often said they are the mafia on wheels. So
Yeah.
they have a very structured. So here's the irony of all of it, really. I mean, not I'll use the Hells Angels as an example, but I mean their whole motto is riding high, living free. To heck with the rules. They want to be these rebels, these outlaws, and yet they are the most conformist groups that I've ever encountered. I mean, they borrow their structure from the military, from the police agencies. They're very rank and file. They have a code of rules and a constitution and bylaws. And you're right, they have like attorneys on retainer. I mean, they're very, very astute and aware of what the legal limits are of certain things. So they don't want to be known for being bad people. They want to be known for their philanthropic work, their charitable work. So it's a really interesting dichotomy. I mean, the image, the public image and the private image of who they present as themselves. So it is a really interesting.
Now, being a defense attorney, and even writing about these highly organized, dangerous groups, have you ever felt like you're in danger during any of this? I guess we could start with the defense attorney. Have you ever had a client, quote unquote, kind of turn on you?
It's only ever happened one time, and it's sort of one of those odd things. Like I've represented some really dangerous people. I've done a lot of capital work, so I've done debt penalty, and and just what I call the run of the mill. You've got your murderers, people that commit ag assault, the drug runners, all of that. And the only time that I've ever really had a threat against me has been on what I call the lower level criminal. The lower level crime. So it can come from any place, anywhere, but mostly, my theory on that is that as their attorney, you have to build a relationship of trust. And so they're trusting you with not only, the mechanics of what they might have done, but a lot of other confidential stuff. And so if you don't have that relationship, that rapport with them to begin with, you're in trouble. And so, in a lot of cases, I'm the only friend they've got, or I'm their last gatepost before they go into prison, or sometimes they're already in prison and I've got them on appeal or post conviction. So I've never really felt that I was in danger. Now, as a prosecutor, I felt I was in danger.
Yeah.
In fact, as a prosecutor, we were trained in weaponry, and we had to go on ride-alongs with police, and wear bulletproof vests. And so that was all part of our training, because there was much more potential for threats and danger as a prosecutor than there is as a defense lawyer.
Yeah, going to, being a DA, a prosecutor, certain states let their DAs carry, guns off duty. They're an officer of the court. So, you're considered law enforcement. A lot of people don't realize that. And, like you said, you're putting away some pretty bad people, and they're not going to be too happy about that. So
Right. Yeah.
they can hold grudges. But writing these books about, like Hell's Angels and all these other, like outlaw motor clubs, did you ever fear like blowback? It's like, they know who I am, and now I'm kind of exposing them.
I never really have, and it's interesting, and I think the reason for that is, I'm telling a story, and I'm telling what happened. So in some cases, it's the undercover investigation. So I'm telling it from the point of view of the operatives that are leading this investigation, and so all the information that I'm writing about is documented. It's coming, from either reporting, I'm interviewing people. And so I've got backups of everything that I'm putting out there. So it's never, I'm never making up any of this stuff. So I haven't gotten blowback that way. And then in some of the other books I've written about the actual people that are living in those clubs. Like the Prodigal Father, Pagan Son was a story about a person who was born into the pagan organized crime family, and his father was the president. He was the founder of it.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, so it was so interesting to write it from that perspective, because I felt like I was inside that inner sanctum, and I write it from what it's like to grow up in that world. When you don't choose that world and you're just growing up in it, what is that? So I never really felt like that was that was a danger zone. Now there were definitely interesting behind the scenes stories that happened in every one of these books, and how I was able to get some of the information. And that was probably scarier than the writing of the book,
So can you tell us any of those?
Well, I mean, they're humorous in retrospect, but it shows so when I was writing Prodigal Father, Pagan Son, one of my favorite stories with that is the main character in that book, his name is LT, Little Tony. And he and I became friends, and we spent 2 years talking to each other at for me, it was 4 a.m. and I would talk to him over the phone. He was in Philadelphia, and he would tell me his life story over the phone. And at one point I thought, I really have to meet him. I can't write this book and not meet him.
Right.
But
Sure.
in my mind, I'm like, I can't go to Philadelphia. Like, that would be insane. Because first of all, my ex-husband did not know I was writing this book. So I was writing.
Guess what, honey?
I was writing a book for 2 years in secret, as I would go into my closet at 4 in the morning and listen, write. And so I was writing the story on sticky notes, because I didn't have a computer in the closet, so the whole thing was just a crazy way to write a story. But so I wound up flying him out to Phoenix and putting him up in a hotel. And my plan was to, spend the weekend as a journalist and interviewing him and getting some of the facts down. And so I thought, and this is how naive I was, I thought that I would have a conversation with him in the coffee shop or the lobby of the hotel. Like, we would meet in the lobby of the hotel. No. So I arrived at the hotel, and, I let him know I was there, and he says, well, come on up. I'm in room whatever. And I'm thinking, come on up. Like,
not cool. Yeah. Okay.
But so those are one of those split second things where you're like, I've been talking to this person for 2 years. I'm writing his life story. I feel like I know him pretty well. And so I get to the hotel room, and he opens the door, and he looks over my shoulder, and he says to me, I can't believe you didn't come without a bodyguard. And so in that moment, like,
hold that thought. Let me get one.
Yeah. And the other really crazy thing about that was I go into the hotel room, and there's my biggest fear. So I always tell the story, it's kind of humorous, but my biggest fear at the time was that he was going to be a smoker. And I was going to have, like, I couldn't imagine, like, how I was going to last, several hours with smoke because I'm so allergic to smoke. And that's what was going on in my head, right? And so I get into the room and he has someone with him. He brought his mentor with him, who
Oh.
is identified as the saint in the book. And
Mm.
his mentor was the vice president of the Pagans.
Oh,
So here I am.
God. Okay.
You know, my ex-husband does not know where I am, and I've not told anyone where I'm at. And that's why I'm in this hotel room and I'm winding up interviewing LT and the Saint for 3 days. And it turned
Wow.
out to be an incredible experience,
Yeah.
really powerful, totally blew my mind because it was not at all what I expected.
Mhm.
And it wound up really making the book. And so the book went on to, you know, win all kinds of awards and became this amazing story. But it was really an interesting sort of behind the scenes of what goes on when you write books like this. I mean, they're not easy books to do by
Right.
any.
So what was the big surprise for you? You know, what were you expecting and how were you surprised?
With that book particularly.
No, when you met little Tony and Saint.
Um, you know, I think what I was most surprised at. So um, the Saint, I was surprised at my response because I really had no fear. And I found it fascinating and really went against type for me. So here's the picture of this. So I walk into the hotel room and the Saint is sitting at the table and he's eating a bowl of Lucky Charms.
Okay.
Not what you would picture at all. And on the TV, he has a National Geographic show on the Alaskan grizzlies. Okay, so I'm like, I mean, that I think was the most surprising because it was not at all what I was expecting. I mean, first of all, I didn't expect to even be in a hotel room talking to LT, but to be there and to have them very accepting of me, number one, you know, and this is a culture, a subculture that hates women. Okay.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
So they've never encountered someone like me. I mean, you know, a lawyer, a writer, I'm walking in there just, you know, with basically a recorder is what I had, you know. And so I'm sitting on the bed and I'm starting a conversation, you know, with LT, and LT is so incredibly open and generous. I mean, not at all what I envisioned
Yeah.
this meet to be, you know. So I think that was the takeaway, is that, you know, I think I was writing a story about a person that just happened to be in this culture. And so yeah, it changed a lot of things for me.
Now, when you had this meeting with these two bikers, were they under any kind of indictment? Were they in the middle of any type of criminal case? Were they discussing criminality? I mean, did they like check you for a wire? Did they, you know, they could have thought that, hey, you know, is she you know, is she an ATF agent? Is she FBI, you know, etc.
Um, Surprisingly, no. It's mean neither one of them had any criminal history. Well, that had been reported, I should say. I don't know about the Saint. Um, so they, at the time, there was no pending indictments or
Okay.
investigation, which was not the case in Running with the Devil. So in Running with the Devil, there were 16 pending indictments of major, you know, people in the Hells Angels.
Okay.
So my writing that book was very risky for me because here I was, a new defense lawyer, a new crime writer, and literally in, you know, with one subpoena, I would have, you know, been disbarred and probably never written again. So it was a
Yeah.
huge risk that I took. And I had been, you know, warned about that, and I did it anyway. So that just shows how, you know, maybe crazy I was. And by the way, did not tell my ex-husband that I was writing that book either. So as you can see, X is the pivotal thing. So,
Wow.
yes,
So
word to the wise, do not write in secret.
yeah. You know, writing a novel while you're working a demanding full-time job and trying to like hold a family together, is very, very tough. And usually it doesn't work unless you have the support of like your spouse or whoever you're living with at the time, and there's got to be some give and take and some understanding, because it's very consuming. And the way that you write these books, like you said before, you dive, head first into it and you immerse yourself in it. It'd be hard to carry on that work-life balance, that'd be really tough.
Yeah, well, and it really, I mean, in retrospect, I think it was completely insane because, this is the PS to that. My very first case out of the gate as a criminal defense attorney, first one, okay, and I was 9 months pregnant when I left my prosecution job to go and become. So that's crazy number one, okay?
Right.
I'm like, so when my very first case, right before I got the call to write Running with the Devil, was a death penalty case. So I didn't even get my feet wet on baby cases. I got
right. That's the biggest one you could get.
Biggest one I could get. And the crazy part of that is, and I was co-counsel on that case, but that case was heard before the United States Supreme Court.
Your first one.
And it overturned 180 death row cases nationwide.
Wow.
So the reason that we have jury sentencings in death penalty cases is because of that case.
Wow.
So it was overwhelming. The whole, here I was, a newbie, working on that death penalty appeal that had such mass attention, just coincidentally. I mean, it wasn't really even something that we thought was going to happen that way, but it just wound up that way. And writing this undercover book, Running with the Devil, in a subject and an area that I knew absolutely nothing about, and I was a brand new mom. So you have the trifecta there, okay? Wow. It was completely insane. And I should say that after Running with the Devil, that story in itself of how that book evolved. I mean, I was halfway through that book and all of my sources went south on me. So then I was writing the book basically undercover. So, how does that happen, or how do you wind up doing that? Where I had a decision about 6 months into that writing project, where I didn't have contracts with my publisher or my agent or anything. It was all verbal. And I could have just backed off and said, I am not doing this, I'm writing about Donnie Brasco on steroids, and maybe I just need to back off of this. But I was so invested in it, and I had put everything on the line that I just made the decision to go for it. But you're right, without the support of my ex-husband, without the support of anybody, because nobody knew I was doing this. None of my friends, my writer friends, had any idea that I was writing this book because I couldn't tell them.
That's a huge secret. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So for 2 years, they all believed I'd given up on writing. And it was such a risk, but it paid off, and it turned into this monumental career for me. And wow. Yeah, it was crazy because at the time nobody was writing about bikers. There was only one book out at the time, and it was Under and Alone, about the infiltration into the Mongols. So there wasn't a guidepost, there wasn't anything, and I just kind of went for it. And I think really what propelled me doing it was I believed so much in the story. And I think that has been the guide for me in all of these books that I've written, is what is the larger message? This isn't, I don't want to glorify the person that I'm writing about. I want to have it reach a wider audience. And I think for me, writing about an outlaw biker culture, I felt was important. It was an important case. It was a landmark case. And there were so many reasons that it was important. And the fact that I had been privileged enough to be able to write it and work on it and expose this was huge for me. And I also thought, people like journalists that write about wars and write about, crimes, I mean, they do it for a compelling and important reason. And it's high risk, but they do it anyway because they believe in it and they believe in that message. And so I think there was a large part of me that sort of went that route, where I thought, I'm going to do this. I'm either all in or I've got to be all out.
Okay. Now, you're an interesting person. You have very interesting stories. And I think some of this was molded by your childhood. You had a bit of an unusual childhood. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I really did. And I think that it's interesting because none of the subjects that I wrote about ever knew about that background. It was just complete serendipity that I actually understood the undercover world so well. And the reason I knew it and I could live it and I could hold people's secrets and hold their confidences was because I grew up in a family of undercover operatives. And so my parents were CIA, and we traveled all over the world and lived in all kinds of different cultural environments. And I grew up knowing that I had to keep secrets and I had to live sort of a double identity, a double life in many cases, because my parents lived a double life. They had double identities. So it was a very familiar world to me. And my ex-husband also worked undercover in many different capacities. So it was normal for us to not share things with each other, to live completely separate double lives. Not good for a marriage, but it was normal. We had normalized the insane, if you will.
So like if your mom left you a note, was it like in code? You had to decipher it, or like at family events they're using spy cameras instead of real ones? I mean, what did it look like?
No, well, so the interesting thing is I didn't know that my parents had a double life until I was 17. So my whole childhood, I was living under the assumption that they were, XYZ. And when I found out that they weren't, it completely, it throws you for a loop because you start to like relive a lot of those memories and you start to ask yourself, was that really a vacation that we were on, or was that an operation? Was I part of that party because I was their daughter, or was I like part of their story, like cover,
Yeah.
So it becomes this very interesting, destabilizing way of looking at your life. But it was absolutely critical for me as a writer because I really understood that. Like I understood when I was writing about these undercover operatives that they couldn't just come out of their cover. They lived it 24/7. And so my parents lived it 24/7. And that's the way I grew up in that world. And so when I learned about what it was when they were 17, so my parents we lived all over Africa, East and West Africa. But then they were ultimately stationed in Poland. And so I would visit them in communist Poland.
Wow.
And really understood like what it was like to be undercover, where you've got surveillance on you, you've got tails, you can't speak in a kitchen because the whole house is bugged. You have to speak outside in the wilderness and go for like walks in the cabbage patch because you might be followed, so like it was very, very real for that part of my life.
Wow. Now, where did you go to high school?
In Kenya.
In Kenya. Wow. What was that like? I mean, I can't even imagine.
It was incredible. It was an incredible experience, and I really took advantage of living in the land that I was in. So when I was in high school, I wound up spending a month living with a Maasai in the Loida Hills. And so we had an anthropology class, and for anthropology, my teacher took us to live with the Maasai. So that was our course, and it was incredible. So I learned all about, subcultures and, blending in and immersing myself in different worlds. And it was, yeah, all of it was just wonderful training ground for what I was going
Yeah.
to.
So you go to the United States and you go to a couple of different colleges, and how did you fit in with just like, normal? How difficult would that be? I mean, what did that look like?
Well, I didn't fit in at all. And that's, I mean, that's a really interesting point. I mean, I never fit in. I was always an outsider and a misfit. I didn't have the same cultural references
Right.
as my peers. You know, I really was, I felt very isolated, very alone. And, you know, that was a transition that I think many children of or dependents of, you know, military, CIA, foreign service, all experience. So you have the incredible, wonderful, rich cultural experience and life that you have overseas, but it does not translate. It doesn't compute
Sure.
when you come back. And that's the rub of it. Like that's the hard part. And again, that was something that I really related to with, you know, infiltrations and people coming in. I mean, how do you pull yourself out of that world and assimilate back into, you know, quote unquote, the real world? You can't, and you don't. And so it leads to a whole host of other interesting, you know, issues, which, you know, where you feel very isolated, like you're not belonging, you know. So here I was writing about all of these groups that their core values were belonging, right?
Right.
Come join us and you will have an identity. You will, you know,
Yeah. You're
give,
in the brotherhood. Yeah, absolutely.
yeah. So there's none of that. So it's a very hard adjustment. And sometimes it never actually makes it as an adjustment.
Wow. Well, let's change gears here, pun intended, from the motorcycle gangs to June of 2012, Aurora, Colorado. A crazed gunman goes into a theater, kills 12 people, injures 70 in one of the worst mass shootings we've ever had. And you write the story of the psychiatrist that was treating this person that did the shooting beforehand. And then she became a villain in so many eyes. She should have had a crystal ball, and she should have seen this coming, and she should have, done X, Y, and Z. I listened to that book. I listened to the audiobook, and I absolutely loved it. You knocked it out of the park. I loved that book. And you're done with the book, and I just felt like that poor woman. Oh my God, the stuff that she went through. Could you kind of tell us a little bit about the evolution of how you started that project and how you gained her trust? Because she was at a point where if I were her, I wouldn't trust anybody. There was so much ambush journalism going on and, gotcha stuff that, she had to change her identity. She had to change the way she looked. She went through hell.
Yeah. So Dr. Fenton was she is an extraordinary woman. She was at the top of her game when she met James Holmes. And so she often said to me, it could not have happened to anyone but her, because nobody else would have been able to survive it or handle it or reinvent herself, have another life. So, so the evolution of the project was it was a gift. It came across my desk by my agent, who said, hey, they're looking for a writer. So there's a screenplay component to it, and they're looking for a writer so they can write the book. And she said, are you interested? And I'm like, yes, of course I'm interested. It was the culmination of everything that I had ever experienced. As a criminal defense lawyer, I really understood the pathology of James Holmes and representing somebody like that and having somebody like that as a client. So I really related to the psychiatrist, Dr. Fenton. And so, when I first met her, I did, I immersed myself in the project the way I did every project. So I flew out to meet her because I thought, we had a couple of Zoom meetings, and, everything's very stiff on Zoom because
Sure.
you can't like just suddenly launch into it and say, hey, tell me how you're traumatized by James.
Yeah.
Like give me the nuts and bolts, so I can write this down. So that's just not how I operate. I'm a method writer, so I really need to see her and meet her. So I flew out to Colorado and we met at a neutral location. And, and I didn't even really interview her at all about the book when I met her, because I wanted to get to know her as a person. I wanted to know her mannerisms. I wanted to know how she dressed. What did she like to do? She had a very quiet, reserved personality. And I think in a lot of ways, we were very similar. And we subsequently discovered how many similarities we have just in personality. And so it wasn't an immediate, oh my gosh, I'm going to tell you my whole life story. I trust you implicitly. It wasn't like that at all. I had to really gain her trust. So when I went out to Colorado, I met a lot of her friends, her fellow colleagues, and we went to dinner. And we went to dinner in the Capitol Grill, which is mentioned a lot in the book, because it was, they were so kind to Lynn and her colleagues during the whole course of this ordeal. So we thought it would be appropriate to go and dine there at the Capitol Grill. So I got to meet her colleagues, and I got to talk to her colleagues about Lynn. And that's the best way to get information about a person without, drilling down and making them feel really subconscious. So I got to learn a lot about her. And then I went back from Colorado from that visit, and just over the course of, weeks and months, we began to talk about what had happened. But meanwhile, there was so much information that she didn't know at the time about James Holmes. So my research of him and the book and watching the trial and learning all of the background stuff was voluminous. I had about 75,000 pages of documents to review.
Oh my God.
And that's not even including the trial itself. So my work was really going on behind the scenes, and it was voluminous. And, I was doing this again on top of my full caseload and a family and
Wow.
PS, a divorce. So like there's all kinds of stuff going on. Life doesn't stop, so, but that was interesting too, because there wasn't an outlet for me either. Like I couldn't really talk to anyone about all of the personal, stuff that was going on. I just had to have eyes forward. I was a professional writer, and this is what I had to do. It's sort of like actors that go on stage, the show must go on. But all of this personal turmoil was happening during the course of writing this book. And yeah, so it was interesting, sort of like.
Now, did the doctor know that you were talking to her friends?
Yes, she was there. Yeah.
Okay. Did you ever interview them when she was not there?
Yes, I did. And so that was an interesting process, because I was very conscious of not re-traumatizing Lynn,
Yeah,
and
but
so,
that's almost impossible though,
right. But it wasn't the kind of book where I, sent her chapters as I was writing them, because particularly about Holmes, because, she didn't know a lot of this stuff. I mean, her part of she had 6 sessions with him as his psychiatrist, so she knew that part. She, of course, knew her testimony in the trial, but she didn't watch the whole trial. I understandably, right? So there was a lot of this stuff that she really had no knowledge of. And so I didn't want to send her chapters each time I wrote the chapter saying, hey, would you review this? And that's not how we operated. So I was very conscious of not re-traumatizing her. And so we would talk about her scenes and her sessions. And then once the book was completed, I would send her the whole thing for approval and say, would you look at this? We decided collectively not to do that with the friends that we had talked to, because, as I was interviewing them, I would ask them and, say, are you comfortable with me putting this in the book? Because there was some very personal stuff in there that I think was very critical to the storytelling. But, had everybody been able to dissect the book and say, oh, take this out, make this change, I would have been insane. So everything about that project was very calculated. And in the end, Lynn read the manuscript and approved it, but she was not involved in the day-to-day editing and rewriting and writing and all of that, because it would have been just way too emotional.
To relive all that. I mean, Could you kind of go over, just a kind of an aerial view of, the case and what she went through? What struck me was, all the different death threats that she had. She was wearing a bulletproof vest. She went out and bought a gun. I mean, she went to extreme measures because there was extreme stuff going on. Could you kind of brush over that real quick?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the case, as you've described, was one of the worst mass shootings in US history at that time in 2012. And James Holmes was a doctoral student in the neurosciences program in Colorado. And he was referred to Dr. Fenton by a social worker because he was having trouble in his graduate program doing oral presentations. He seemed very anxious and, just awkward and had a hard time with it. So the social worker believed that, there was something deeper going on. So she referred him to Lynn Fenton. And Lynn, at the time, she's head of student mental health. She actually taught courses on mass shootings. I mean, she was an expert in every sense of the word. And she meets with Holmes and she has 6 sessions with him. And on the 6th session, realizes that, there is something seriously wrong, but he's not mentally ill. So that was a very interesting position that she took, especially for a psychiatrist, because she believed that he was evil. So she advanced this whole theory in the book that he personified evil, not mental illness. So there was nothing that she could do. She couldn't put him on a mental health hold. So a mental health hold is what she was vilified for. People were saying, why didn't you lock him up? Why didn't you put him away? And, in her defense, she did everything she possibly could, including violating HIPAA by contacting Holmes' mom.
I remember that in the book. Yeah.
Has he always been this odd? Is there something up with him? Did he have a psychotic break? Is something going on? So she did everything that she could to try to prevent what happened at the movie theater. And it wasn't enough. And so the public vilified her. They went crazy and they wanted somebody to blame and they needed somebody to direct their rage at. And I think that's a very common response. But what it did for Fenton was it completely upended her life. And, she had a full caseload, 80 patients at the time. She was, taught courses. She was head of student mental health, all of this stuff going on at the time of Holmes. And what happened and what irrevocably changed her life was that a defense attorney, a week after Holmes is, in custody, files a motion with the court and he outs Lynn Fenton in the motion. And this is like something that is never done. It has never been done before. Nobody ever knows who the treating psychiatrist is. Nobody puts the name of the treating psychiatrist in a court document. So the press got a hold of this. Now they knew who the person was. And Lynn was a target. She was a moving target. So she couldn't go back to her home. She was in hiding. She had to leave the state at one point. She had to resign from student mental health. She had her caseload of 80 patients was divided up into with other psychiatrists. She wound up getting death threats from almost every press related, entity. Random death threats from the public. She couldn't answer. She had to change her phone number, change her email. Then she had to worry about lawsuits from surviving victims.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
They were suing the university. So then the university was worried about malpractice, and so then she had to review for almost it took 3 years to bring Holmes to trial. So she was going over and over and over again with civil lawyers, being deposed by civil attorneys, was she going to be on the chopping block for malpractice?
Yeah.
I mean, all of these things were happening to her. And while she was getting all these death threats, she would take alternative routes to work. She would wear disguises. She was fitted for a bulletproof vest, as was her colleague, who was also the head of the psychiatry department, as was his wife. So they were fitted for these bulletproof vests. She had to wear this vest almost on a daily basis. And we describe it in the book, how uncomfortable it was, how she felt like she was in a box walking around, and so then she, of course, contemplated, do I need a gun? So her whole life changed, and it's continued to change. I mean, it was irrevocably changed. She couldn't go back to what she was doing. And so she wound up really trying to reinvent herself and relocating and, figuring out how she was going to still practice psychiatry, but, from a distance. And so it's, in many ways, she was the penultimate victim of James Holmes, because there was no way a psychiatrist can only know what a patient reveals. And I think that is probably one of the most important takeaways from this book, is that, she couldn't drill down and find out and know that Holmes, while he was seeing her, was amassing an arsenal.
Right. He had booby traps in his house, because he knew that law enforcement would do a search warrant on his house. So he had booby traps there. And, what people don't understand is the police can put a mental health hold on somebody, and that's only good for 72 hours. And there's a court hearing, if you're going to keep somebody confined against their will. And that takes a lot. And that has to be like an immediate threat. And you have to be able to prove all that.
Right.
And that's where people just don't understand. There's no magic wand for this at all.
No, and that's the really sad thing, is that there isn't a way to really spot or stop a mass shooter. I mean, you had this book is really sort of like, you can put a microscope on the life cycle of a mass shooter. I mean, that's really what this is. And, even with all of that, with like the most intelligent minds in the country overseeing James Holmes, nobody could predict that he was going to do this. And that's the terror behind it. And since then, of course, we had a ton of mass shootings, and nobody can predict anything. And, I mean, it's just understandably, everybody's desperate for some kind of relief, some kind of solution to this. And it's just not an easy answer.
Right. So writing Aurora, and maybe even some of the other books, do you think it's changed you? Has it made you like a little more hyper vigilant when you're out and about? Like, if you see a motorcycle rolling up next to you and they're wearing Hell's Angels colors, are you kind of like, okay?
Yeah, I think it has definitely changed me. I mean, it has made me consciously present.
Yeah.
is a way of saying it. I don't take anything for granted. And yeah, I mean, I really do I've never really been one to trust people readily, but I think it really makes me kind of take a second look at.
Sure. I could totally see that. Do you keep in touch with any of these people that you've written these books with?
Yes, actually, all of them. I developed such good rapport with everyone that I wrote about, including LT, including the boss of the Chicago Outlaws and the last Chicago boss. I mean, I got to know these individuals on such an intimate level that I think it would be strange in a lot of ways not to still keep up with them. I get Christmas cards from them. I communicate with them. In a lot of ways, I think I probably was the first person that they actually confided in on very personal, vulnerable details of their life. And so, yeah, it's been a very interesting odyssey.
I do not doubt that. Now, going back to your defense attorney days, and you did capital crimes, etc. What's your view on the death penalty?
I think probably have a surprising view of it to some people, but I don't think that it brings the closure that people believe it does. I mean, I think on a philosophical level, the death penalty sounds like it would be the penultimate punishment. But the problem is that it's not immediate, and there are so many opportunities to appeal, and it drains the justice system. And even though these individuals deserve everything they've gotten, I don't know that it's really working as a deterrent or as a way to bring closure to families, because they're still alive 20 years later, and I guess if it was an immediate thing, if you could take him out and, I don't know, I'm gonna get crucified for saying this, put him on the firing squad, and that would be the end of it, then it might actually serve a purpose. But I think for me, it doesn't serve a purpose. It just prolongs the inevitable, and it keeps it open. And the fact that they can appeal over and over again, it's not bringing any type of relief for the victims.
Yeah, the way I look at it is, the whole eye for an eye. If you could do this in a speedy way, then I think there would be relief for the family. But if the family's waiting around for 20 years for different appeals, et cetera, I mean, they're dealing with the grieving process as it is. And now this is heaped on top. I could see both sides of that argument. Philosophically, I'm like, yeah, there is pure evil out there, and there is no reason for this person to exist because they are that evil, et cetera. But we do have a court system, and there are reasons why we do what we do. And God forbid you would never want an innocent person, to fall under that. So there has to be those safeguards, but it's almost to the point of being ridiculous on how some of these things work. Yeah. And again, it all falls back to the family. And I think the family should have the ultimate say, the victim, if somebody, God forbid, would kill, like one of your children or something like that. It's like the parents should say, yeah, thumbs down, almost like a Roman Coliseum, and it's like, no, sorry, you're stealing oxygen and you're not going to do it anymore. That's the way I see it. But, and then there's, higher profile cases like, say, Jeffrey Dahmer. I was a cop in Milwaukee, so that's the default. Milwaukee used to be the city of, like Happy Days and, Fonzie and Potsy, and then Dahmer kind of stole the innocence from the city. And, there was never a question of guilt. It was a question of insanity. What's your view on that?
It's interesting. I mean, I think it's sort of the same. I think it's appropriate in some circumstances, because you don't want to put to death a person who is truly mentally ill, truly insane. But, I think that it's, again, a very hard threshold to meet. And I think that a lot of times it gets tossed around. I mean, certainly someone like Dahmer, what he did is insane. And I think it's important to separate the monster from the monstrous acts, from the insane acts that a person does. And so I think, my answer would be, it depends.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, with Dahmer, the whole defense was, and the offense was, he knew right from wrong. He knew that it was wrong for him to be torturing and killing all these people. Where the defense attorney is like, well, obviously this man is mentally ill. He's insane. So you have to prove, was he insane at the time of these murders? I mean, that's a tough nut to crack.
Right. And it is a different standard. Legal insanity is different from, is somebody actually insane? Because you're right. No rational person would do what Dahmer did. And yet, to your point, he knew what he was doing.
Yes.
And and the same with James Holmes, he knew what he was doing. So it's a tricky area. And I think that it can be misleading.
Yeah. You know what? I think this is a good place for us to stop. We're so cheery here, aren't we? Talking about Jeffrey Dahmer and, the death penalty. What the heck? But what are you working on now? What's in your future?
I am working on a project that hopefully will come to fruition, that involves a stalker. So it's in my wheelhouse of, pathology and probably a little bit of insanity. And I think it's gonna be a really interesting case. It's in the very early stages, so I can't divulge too much, but that's
Okay.
the subject.
All right. If people want to learn more about you and your books, where do they go?
They should check out my website, kerriedroban.com, or go to Amazon. All of my books are on Amazon if they want to order them. Or, turn on investigation ID and I'll be on the channel somewhere.
Okay. Well, I will put those in my show notes. I'll put your website in the show notes, and that probably has links to everything else, I would imagine.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Very good. Well, thank you so much. This has been a very good interview. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.